right, so welcome back to the part 3 of the TSA Teams 2013 competition. Now in this video we're going to go ahead and talk about scenario 3, and really we're going to look at wireless networks. And so you can see in this scenario what's being asked of us is engineers can design protections to prevent vulnerable wireless networks from breaches by external attacks. And here's the thing, there really are several recent, within the past 5 years to 10 years, real major data compromises that I can think of explicitly because of poorly designed, poorly implemented, or poorly secured wireless networks. And so this really is a very big deal. It's a big deal for homes, of course, but it's an even bigger deal for enterprises because companies everywhere are now using wireless networks everywhere we go. And oftentimes it's very poorly implemented. I was doing some consulting work at one point for a company and was doing some wireless analysis for them and asked a simple question of, how is this working for you? And I even had my laptop out and saw they had completely unsecured wireless networks and, no authentication whatsoever. And I asked him, how is this working? How do you have this connected into your enterprise network? And he's like, well, we just have it connected right into the switch. And I'm like, okay, so is it, on a different VLAN? No. Is your wireless, is it segmented off in any kind of way or firewalled off? No. So what you're telling me is pretty much you're just delivering free internet access to anybody who is within range of your networks. And he's like, yeah, but it's just for our company, right? And I'm like, well, what's to stop me from sitting in the parking lot and just connecting right in and doing scans and man-in-the-middling you and all kinds of other stuff? And they, just kind of looked at me with that blank stare of, nothing. So this really is a big deal. When it comes to wireless, the thing is most of us, we use it all the time. I mean, I talk to my students all the time and ask them the question, how many of you guys have wireless at home, in the dorms, in your apartment? And all of them raise their hand, 100% of them. So wireless is something that we use every single day. And the thing is most of us are pretty familiar with it, at least from a basic level. A lot of people have come very far in just being aware of the differences, for example, between A, B, G, or N wireless networks. And we know, N, hey, it's better than G for the most part, right? So a lot of us were pretty much aware of the differences between these different versions. And we know about encryption. We know about WEP and WPA and WPA2. And we at least have a brief amount of familiarity between all of them. But I do still think it's very important to go just a little bit over some of the history of wireless and see where we've been and why we are at where we are now. So looking at this, it really is no surprise to realize that wireless was really developed for military use, a lot like the internet was itself in terms of being, military, especially in the Cold War, and where data was the important thing was keeping our data redundant and alive in the case of some kind of nuclear war. Wireless was developed for military use as well, and that really makes a lot of sense. We can think of plenty of military applications for wireless, right? The thing is, though, it wasn't until about 2001 when a guy named Peter Shipley, don't know if you've heard of him or not, but he presented on a topic called war driving. And he did this at DEF CON in 2011, and for the first time people are like, uh-oh, yeah, this is actually really important stuff, and we need to be aware of the risks to wireless, because back in those days no one secured wireless. It was just kind of open, and a lot of people didn't have wireless. Laptops didn't come with it by default installed, and it wasn't at the time a big deal. But Peter had the foresight to see where the world was going and how much we were going to use wireless, to where I'm sure he even knew that even our mobile devices, our phones in our pockets, we're going to have antennas and can connect to anything modern, right? And so he had this idea of presenting a paper called War Driving. And what the idea was essentially just as we drive or as we walk, essentially as we move, let's look for wireless networks and let's see if they're secure, if they're not secure, what level of security they've got. And so there was at one time, this got very popular, this idea of war chalking. And as we would walk down the streets or go wherever we were going, it was very common for, at least in big cities, to see people just take sidewalk chalk and mark when they find a network. And so these are some of the symbols they would use. So, here's the actual SSID, whatever the name of the network is, of course, and perhaps the bandwidth if we could find it. And this little symbol, looks like two C's facing each other, was simply saying, hey, this is an open network. Here you go. You want in, you got it. Here's a closed node. So this was kind of closed off. I guess basically the two half circles, faced in to make a full circle with the SSID. So we're not able to know exactly what's going on here, but we know there's wireless. And then another one, this was WEP. So this is WEP secured. And again, at the time, that was the best we had. As we've found out recently, though, or not even recently, the past 5 to 10 years, WEP is highly, quickly, easily crackable. So we would see this as well. And so these are some examples of word chalking symbols that we had seen in the past. Now, just very quickly looking at some of the differences between wireless networks all the way up to 2005. And we are going to talk about the future after wireless, at least after 802.11n. But here are the different standards we have. So we have the IEEE standards, 802.11, 11a, 11b, 11g, 11n. Because I'm lazy, I'm not going to say 802.11 all times. I'm just going to require it, talk about 11, 11a, 11b, so on and so forth. So we see the years that these were created and the progression. We do see that A and B were kind of co-created at the same time. We see the frequencies, and we'll talk about this a little bit. We see the bands, most of them are ISM, and then we see the bandwidth availability. And notice we do really see, except again, A and B are kind of a different story in terms of them being developed at the same time, but we see the bandwidth increasing as well between each of them. And so it kind of just gives you an overview of wireless itself. Now, the thing is, most wireless LANs would operate, at least today and for the past since 97 or so, they've all operated under IEEE's 802.11 standard. And so these standards essentially call forth, this is how we're going to do wireless. And if you want to create a device that broadcasts this wireless Ethernet, or you want to create a device that receives it, you need to follow along with our standards. Okay, and this idea of standards is very good, because then I can buy any off-the-shelf product and it says it conforms to 802.11. Or whatever letter, 802.11n, and I know it will work with anything else that's 802.11n. So this is why these standards are very, very important. IEEE has a lot of these, and IEEE is pretty much a huge industry leader in terms of standards creation in our field. So the very first one was actually, if we go back a slide, we see this, it was 802.11. It didn't have a letter moniker after, it was just 802.11. And so 802.11 was created around 97, but the thing is, it was very, very slow. Look at this, its max speed topping out was 2 megabits per second. Not fast. And this is total speed on the access point. Total speed. So all the users connected in together, we're going to get a total of 2 megabit. Well, goodness, you can get DSL at its slowest versions today for either 1.5 megs or 3 megs down, even from pretty much any DSL carrier. So even at its slowest, cheapest availability today, it's not going to work, right? Not to count typical modern download bandwidth speeds of 15 megs, 50 megs, and so on and so forth that we're seeing quite common now. So this really was not very fast, and so it didn't take long for new iterations of 802.11 to come out and to improve upon the original. And so the first one that came out was or at least co-created, was A. So 802.11a and B were created around the same time in 1999. B really took off and became more popular in many people's opinion, including my own. It's partially just because of good marketing, but there are some differences between the two. First of all, A, it had a lot more of a niche in business networks rather than home networks. And so a lot of businesses at the time in 1999 thought, and 2000 thought, why are we needing to roll out wireless? What use is there in this? It's slow. We don't really understand. It's very expensive. And so A did have a niche in businesses, but there weren't a lot of businesses that really wanted it. Whereas in home networks, it became a lot easier to see the relevance and use of having wireless because laptops were becoming popular. So the bandwidth speed of 802.11a was 54 megabits, and it operated at about 5 gigahertz, in the 5 gigahertz band, I should say, in that range. And so the nice thing about it at the time was that it had very, very good ability to not have interference. The bad thing, though, is it didn't have the range and signal, at least the signal penetration, the ability to go through walls, concrete, things like that, that 802.11b had. And so one of the marketing blurbs that hurt 802.11a was everyone said, well, its range is terrible. It doesn't get very far, right? And so that really kind of hurt it somewhat. It does have faster maximum speed, but really the range didn't go as far as B. And so that was one problem. The other problem, of course, was higher cost. So with B, again, created at the same time, it only went up to 11 megabits. So not very fast, but again, keep in mind, in 1999, 11 megabits was pretty screaming fast. That really was not a bad speed at all. It operated at the 2.4 gigahertz band, and the reason for that is because 2.4 gigahertz band is unregulated. And if you really wonder the history on this, the reason 2.4 gigahertz is unregulated is because, and really when I say unregulated, I mean that any vendor can create something that operates at 2.4 without having to pay the FCC or whatever your country's licensing agency is because a long time ago when microwave ovens were coming out, guess what the resonant harmonic of water was, or is? It's 2.4 gigahertz. That is the resonant harmonic to heat water, to move those molecules of H2O. And so when microwaves were becoming popular in the 60s and 70s, they just decided to unlicense the 2.4 gigahertz band. They say any electronics can use 2.4 because microwaves are popular, and this is a great thing. And it didn't take long for other types of devices to say, you know what? I got to make a wireless network. Why don't I use 2.4 gigahertz? Because it's free to use it. I don't have to pay to use that band. It's free. And so one of the nice things is it made 802.11b cheap to use. Any vendor could now create an 802.11b and not have to worry about paying FCC for licensing. The problem with that, though, that many people didn't consider is, well, now we're going to have interruption with other electronic devices that use 2.4 gigahertz. So what happens if I, pop some popcorn with my microwave and it fires out frequency at high power and a huge band of 2.4 gigahertz? It really spans the entire spectrum and kills my signal. So there was a lot of problems with not with obstruction, but a lot of problems with interference with the actual signal. And so this was very frustrating, but it did make the devices cheaper, and it had good signal range because it operates at a lower frequency. If you're familiar with the way that signal theory works, it goes further, and so that was a nice thing as well. It had a much better range than A, and so that's kind of the differences between A and B. Now, G comes out in 02, 03 or so, and it really hits the market pretty strong, and it really has a lot of advantages. It goes all the way up to 54 megabits like A did, so that was really nice. It used 2.4 gigahertz, so it did have that long range. It was backwards compatible to B, and again, keep in mind, most homes already had B, so to say, hey, my laptop already supports B, but I can get a faster, AP now, a faster access point that's G, and it'll work. My laptop will still work. Seems like a no-brainer. So for all those reasons, G really took off and was great. It still had the problem of signal interference, but because it had a long range, you put the AP in the right place and not right next to your microwave. You don't use your microwave all the time. It worked pretty well. But there were, of course, other devices too, like baby monitors and things like that, that even wireless or cordless telephones that operate on the same band and did cause problems. Now, the newer one that most of you guys are quite familiar with is 802.11n. This has become fully drafted and has been around for a while, but it wasn't drafted until just a few years ago, or at least fully drafted until a few years ago. One of the reasons that it goes up to 100 megabit plus is because it takes advantage of MIMO antennas, or what stands for multiple input, multiple output antennas. And so we can have multiple antennas kind of doing the same job together. So it just kind of doubles our firepower, so to speak. Now, the nice thing about N, it was backwards compatible to G. So again, you had some kind of G laptop or whatever it was that was using 802.11g, you upgrade your access point to 802.11n, and those devices will still work. Again, that's very important for people that are wanting to upgrade. You don't have to upgrade all your gear at once. And so the nice thing about N is it has a lot faster speed, good range. It's pretty resistant to interference because it can work at 5 gigahertz or 2.4, and I didn't mention that, but it can. And so that's one of the very nice things about 802.11n. It really has all the best features of all the other ones in the past, but just it's faster, right? The only real con to it is it just costs more than 802.11g, and so that's the obvious only bad side. Now, what's coming out new on the horizon? The newest one is 802.11ac, and so for the first time, IEEE has kind of ignored the monikers of, A, B, G, N. You'd think maybe T would be next or something, but it's actually AC, and that's the newest one that's coming out. And we're just now seeing those routers come out. They operate at the 5 gigahertz band, which is good because we're not going to see any signal interference with any of their old 2.4 gigahertz stuff, and microwaves, it'll always be at 2.4 because that's how they heat water. We do expect around 2015 for this to become kind of the common standard. The nice thing, look at that speed, up to 1 gigabit per second. That's really pretty nice. 1 gigabit per second is pretty good right now. Now, you watch this video in about 5 to 10 years and you might think, that's not near enough. But right now, not bad. So again, The pros, well, it's the fastest, it's got the most features, it's got better security features, it's got good signal range, it's resistant to interference, it's really got a lot of great things about it. The only bad thing about it right now is the standards aren't finalized. You can buy 802.11ac routers. I've seen some of them on the market now, but the standards aren't finalized, so it is possible you buy a router that supports maybe some feature that doesn't become standard, or it doesn't have a feature, a physically implemented feature, because you bought a router so on the bleeding edge, and it got added into the standard later on. So there is some risk to that, but by and large, boy, the advantages of having an 802.11ac network are pretty obvious, and so that's really what's coming out soon. So now that we know the history, let's talk about securing our routers. Here are a few things that you can do. And I'm going to talk about each of these and really not talk about these in a good light but in a bad light. One of the things we can do is we can hide our SSID. And some people do this and they think it's a great thing to do because they think, well, no one can see my network. Well, the problem is anyone with any basic tool like NetStumbler, Kane, many other tools, Kismet, so many others can just easily see what your SSID is, even if you're trying to hide it from being filtered, because any device that talks is going to have to use it and have to include it. So any device that can go in monitor mode is going to be able to see your SSID. So does it help? Yeah, kind of, sort of, but it doesn't really help in security, and with all truth be told. Now, there are some people that will will advocate the idea of hiding your SSID, because how many people these days actually go and look for it? Well, granted, maybe not dedicated for it, but if I'm going to focus on attacking your company, I am going to look to see if you have a hidden SSID. It's just part of the game. So it's definitely not something you should use as your sole security mechanism, but it can help. In other ways, it cannot help. It really comes down to a matter of opinion, but everyone will agree it's easy to find an SSID if you've hidden them. Okay. Another thing is MAC filtering. So we can actually see what hardware devices. A MAC address is a physical address that's been added to any network interface card, any network card that connects to a network. The thing about this is it's very easy to have software that just spoofs the MAC address. So again, I can be in monitor mode, I can see devices that are looking on the network and getting access to the access point, and I can see the MAC address that they're using. Well, I can easily use software that's available on Linux, Windows, Android, jailbroken iPhones, all kinds of stuff where we can easily spoof a MAC address. Not hard to do. So MAC filtering, does it help? Kinda, sorta, but not really. Again, anybody who knows anything about wireless security knows how to spoof a MAC address. So doesn't really help. Now, WEP. This is the one that pretty much everyone will agree WEP is not a good idea to use. It is pretty much instantly crackable. There are a couple easy ways to go about cracking it. I've shown you a couple examples. One using Backtrack on the left here, which is a version of Linux where we have cracked it, and a version over here with Kane. And with Kane, of course, we haven't actually sent this to the cracker. We're just seeing that it's available, seeing that we can crack it. But we can take some of this data right here and we can analyze it and send it over and begin to crack it when we have enough data here to do that. So in either case, it's very easy to actually crack this based upon a mathematical flaw in WEP. And we're not going to talk about that in this class or in this lecture, but just do know that that is a real possibility and a real risk with WEP. We should not ever use WEP anymore. So how do we secure our routers? Well, one thing that can help, again, is changing our keys frequently. It's always a good idea to change our passwords. We should never use the same one forever, right? Just like passwords for the internet, we need to change passwords on our wireless routers. A bad guy can easily grab that key, and it may be encrypted, but he can then, once he grabs the actual hashed or encrypted key, he can begin to attack it offline, and that's why we need to change keys. He may not get it right away, but within a day, a month, he may get it, a year. So we need to actually keep our passwords fresh, at least if you're using a single key for access. Another thing we need to do is place our access points on a DMZ. So here's a graphic example of this. We've placed, granted this is an old router, but we've placed a router here, and notice that this is on the external edge of our network. Here's our LAN switch, and probably there's a router somewhere around here as well, right here. And what we're doing is we're placing this on the edge of our network. So when a bad guy or a good guy connects to our wireless, they're not actually behind our network, they're in front of our network. And so in order to get access to all of these services, they still have to go through our switch. Or maybe these services would even be behind maybe some other firewall. Maybe they're down here behind this firewall. So they would still have to filter all the way through, depending on how your network is set up. But either way, it's a really good idea to make sure that this device is on the external exit or egress side, outside of our internet, and not the inside. So they don't immediately have internet access that bypasses or network access that bypasses some of our security controls. So it's very important to keep our APs on the edge of our network when we can. Some other things, using VPN. VPN-based technology is great because what would happen is a user may be connecting to this wireless device right here, but all this device would do is just wirelessly serve a connection, and then this just tunnels everything maybe to a VPN server that's over here, and that VPN server would require further authentication. Now, the nice thing about that is it encrypts the entire session, so it makes it very difficult for a bad guy to take advantage of it. The bad problem with VPN, though, is it doesn't roam well. So a lot of times if I walk, if I'm maybe moving and I switch from AP to AP, I may lose the connection. So there's a lot of problem. There can be, not a lot, but there can be problems with VPN. Now, a lot of modern-based VPNs can actually do handoffs between APs and keep your connection valid, but that can be a problem. Another thing we should always use is WPA2. Much, much better than WPA. So far, there have been pieces of WPA that have been broken, but WPA itself has not been broken, not like WEP has. So if we look at the differences here between WPA, WPA2, and even WEP, we see the encryption that they're using. Both WEP and WPA are using RC4. WPA2 is using AES with longer key strings, so it's really typically a better way to go. We see how the keys rotate. Obviously, no key rotation here. And then we see some other things too. And some of the big things with WPA and WPA2 is they support Eep Based Authentication. We'll talk about that here in just a second and why that's better, but do keep in mind that is very nice. Now, how do we authenticate? Well, one way to do it is just shared key authentication. So a client, he says, hey, I need access to this AP, and the AP comes back and says, okay, you can have access. Here's a challenge. You need to correctly answer this challenge. Okay, and we're not going to talk about challenge response mechanisms and encryption in this video, but here's essentially what happens. The AP says, hey, you want to talk to me? Okay, no problem, but I'm sending you some kind of information. And what you need to do with this information or this challenge is you need to respond back with the challenge and some kind of encrypted information that proves your identity, that proves you're really the person you say that you are. And so the AP then gets this challenge and the encrypted information, and typically what it is he gets back the same challenge he sent, but he also gets an encrypted version of the challenge, and he decrypts it, and he basically makes sure that when he decrypts that challenge with the user's password that the AP should already have access to, with that key that he already has access to, that when he decrypts it, he sees the challenge come back and it matches up, and he says, this is the real challenge I sent you, so I can verify that it's you. Now, there are a lot of reasons we use challenge response, and it may be difficult to understand, again, at a high level, but one of the nice things about challenge response is so that if a bad guy sees that entire communication session, he can't just replay that entire attack all over again. If he tries to get access himself, then he's going to get a brand new challenge from the AP, and that brand new challenge is going to make it to where he can't send back the same data that the valid client sent earlier. It's going to be totally different. So the nice thing about a challenge is it's different every time. It prevents what's called replay attacks. Okay, but here's the problem with this. A bad guy that does see this will see the challenge that comes across and will see the response, and then he could do what's called brute force attack or dictionary attack that challenge. He could actually grab back the response from the challenge that the client sends and go offline and just try to attack it. And that's what we were talking about earlier about offline-based attacks. This right here is exactly what he's attacking. Is he's attacking that encrypted response. And if he can ever happen to correctly decrypt it, then he knows what the password is. And if he knows what the password is, now he can request access, get a challenge, and use the password that he found out and answer it correctly and get access. And so that's why this whole idea of shared key authentication is a very bad idea for anything but home networks. And even home networks, if you can avoid it, it'd be good to avoid it. This whole idea is somewhat broken because this is the weak area right here. If a bad guy gets access to this, he can try to crack it. And if he does crack it and get access, he now has access as you. Very dangerous. Now, one thing that eliminates this is this Eep Based Authentication. Okay? And what this does is it gets rid of the whole idea of shared key authentication. There's no challenge response whatsoever. And what happens is the supplicant, or the client is a better word to use if you're not familiar with these terms, is he basically gets access to an authenticator. And usually the authenticator in this case is simply the access point. And so we get an encrypted session right here using WPA simply to get access between the authenticator and the supplicant, secure access. Okay? And then what happens is, and again, we are not going to get in depth into this, but generally there's a back-end authentication server. And so a Radius server is a good example of this. Have you ever heard of Radius? Or TACAX is another one. And what happens is the authenticator is kind of the proxy, kind of the middleman between the data that he sends to the authenticator and the authentication server here itself. And so he gets information through an Eep-based session, and he gets it and says, okay, here's the information I got. The authenticator says, I don't know if it's correct or not. I don't have the answer. But he then fires it to the authentication server, which does have the answer, or at least has the ability to get access to the answer, and he checks and see if it's correct. If it's correct, then he sends it right back to the authenticator and says, this is correct. This is all right. And then the authenticator then says, okay, because I got an okay, good to go from the Radius server, I'm going to grant you access to the network. And then he gives him access, and now he's got back-end access to the network, whether it's the internet or just internal, LAN access. He's got access. And so that's how Eep works, at least from a high level. And Eep actually gets rid of this whole challenge response thing that you can see and then begin to crack, and that's very nice. One of the reasons that we don't see a lot of homes and even small business use 802.1x or Eep based authentication is because it requires more devices. It requires an authenticator, which we have. Usually the AP is the authenticators we've mentioned, but it requires a back-end authentication server. And in many cases, the back-end authentication server isn't the end itself. If you've ever heard of Active Directory and domain services, a lot of times this actually hits off Active Directory, and we'll go back to this network on everybody's behalf over here and talk to Active Directory and see if it's correct or not. And so unfortunately, this setup requires more configuration and more actual devices. And so this is why we don't see it a lot of times in other networks, okay? So what kind of risks do we face in wireless security? Well, one thing is traffic flooding. Unfortunately, it doesn't matter how secure I am if my devices cannot handle the amount of traffic flow. I can just have a device that goes into master mode, if you've ever heard of master mode, and just flood someone's network. Even if I don't have access to it, I can just flood the network. And this is what's called the denial of service attack. Very, very dangerous, very, very aggravating. Not much you can do except for finding that rogue client and getting him off your network. So, and we will actually talk about ways that you can find that in the next slide. So traffic flooding, that's one big problem. Just flood the network with traffic, whether we actually have access or not. Another thing is we've talked about hash stealing and cracking. When that challenge response comes across, can we actually see that, grab the response that has the challenge in it and decrypt it? And if we can decrypt it, then we now know who you are and we know your password and we get access. So this idea of hash stealing and cracking is very, very dangerous. Another one, though, that's dangerous is man-in-the-middle based attacks. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Wi-Fi Pineapple, but it is a very cool device and very scary device. And what this guy can do is it simply says this. This is really the high-level view of what it does, is it simply operates and usually has internet access on the back end, and it may not even, doesn't have to. And what it does, though, is anytime a wireless, like a laptop, says, hey, I'm looking for my home network, which is Linksys, or which is, Professor Wes's home network, whatever my SSID is called, this Pineapple is a nefarious little thing. It basically answers back and says, oh, I'm that network. I'm the SSID you're looking for. I'm your home Linksys network. And because the way that modern laptops work right now, the way that 802.11 works right now, is essentially when that device sees its SSID, it trusts it. Even if it's not the same original one, it trusts it. And this is a big problem. And the Pineapple simply grants internet access and says, here I am. And it really serves as a middleman. And a lot of times what will happen with the Pineapple is it serves it without encryption. And here's the crazy thing. If your home network, let's say it's Professor West network, is WPA2 encrypted, and this Pineapple, you're at a coffee shop and someone's got a Pineapple device, and all of a sudden you see, you're 20 miles away at a coffee shop, and it says your network and it's unencrypted, your laptop will still trust it and connect to it. And that's what's really scary about this. That's what's scary about the Pineapple, is that it basically just emulates a network, and it emulates it without security, and your laptop trusts it. So this is how a man-in-the-middle attack works, is essentially this guy inserts itself in the middle of a real communication session. Now that in and of itself is not real dangerous. Here's where the danger comes in. The instant this device inserts itself in the middle of the session, it now has the ability to see what you're doing. So let's say you're at you're on your laptop, you're in a coffee shop, and you're connected to this device unknowingly, and then this one has a connection back to the coffee shop's real internet access. The instant, let's say you go to your bank's website in the coffee shop, which by the way you should never do, and you try to authenticate, this guy can potentially intercept that and either see your password in clear text and decrypt it by use of maybe Kane or plenty of other, SSL strip or other based attacks, or it could at least grab the hash itself and use to later crack offline. That's what a man-in-the-middle attack is this guy is basically just inserting himself in the middle of your session and can see your data. It's very, very scary stuff, okay? So how can we stop some of this? One thing that we need to do is have good software that can detect rogue APs. And so this really would be serving as a rogue AP. It'd be an AP that we don't know about. And there is plenty of software that can do this. Cisco is well known for having some software. I know here at the university we have this software, and it's very nice. And what it can do is actually use, it kind of looks like heat mapping. And it sees where the signal is coming from by triangulation of other access points and can say, we know with certainty it's within this range right here. So then what we do is we call up our security staff and they go find that guy. And it's really not too hard to find. Look at this. Oops, went too far. It's really not too far, or not too far apart. It'd be easy to actually find this device. And so rogue AP detection is very, very nice. It's not hard to do. A lot of software and hardware combinations that are enterprise worthy can do this. Another thing that would be nice is detection of these hack tools. So some modern intrusion detection and prevention systems can detect this stuff, especially ones like Kane, that if they're man in the middling, they're constantly sending out what's called ARP requests. We have the ability to detect those things on the network. And so NetStumbler, Kane, Fake AP, there are any of these tools that I'm listing here for you that do these types of either scanning or actual wireless hacking or wireless cracking. These tools and others usually leave some kind of network trace that are detectable. So we need to not only detect it, but also see that alert and respond to it. So those are some things that we need to be concerned about. So we're going to stop here at scenario 4 and pick back up later on scenario 4, which is concerning ourselves with attacks by protesters and hacktivism and that sort of thing. So we'll come back to section 4, scenario 4 in the next lecture.